The city was alive with its usual chaos, cars honking, people rushing, the distant hum of street vendors. Among the crowd walked a music producer, a man who had spent years shaping hits but had lately felt something missing. The industry had become predictable, and he longed for something real, something raw. As he turned a corner, the noise faded for just a moment. And then he heard it. A guitar. Not just any playing, this was different. The notes were soulful, filled with pain and hope, like the musician was pouring his entire life into the strings. The producer stopped, his ears catching something he hadn't heard in years, pure, unfiltered emotion. He followed the sound to a dimly lit alley. There, sitting on an old cardboard box, was a homeless man. His clothes were worn, his face lined with hardship, but his fingers moved over the guitar with the skill of someone who had once known better days. People walked past without a glance, tossing coins occasionally, but no one really listened. The producer did. He stood there, frozen, as the melody wrapped around him. It wasn't just music, it was a story. When the song ended, the homeless man looked up, surprised to see someone still standing there. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the producer knew he had to talk to him. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The man hesitated, then smiled faintly. "A lifetime ago," he said. And with those two words, the producer realized, this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the beginning of something unforgettable. The producer crouched down, ignoring the damp pavement beneath his shoes. He had met countless musicians in studios and stages, but none had ever stopped him in his tracks like this. "That last song," he said, "what was it called?" The homeless man strummed a slow, sad chord. "No name. Just something I play when the nights get too long." His voice was rough but warm, like an old record played one too many times. The producer nodded. He had heard enough polished voices in his career, this was different. This was real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, but the man shook his head. "Not for money," the producer said. "For coffee. And a conversation." The man studied him for a moment, then carefully placed his guitar, an old, scratched-up thing with missing tuning pegs, into a tattered case. He stood, his movements slow but deliberate, as if every step carried the weight of years. They walked to a nearby diner, the kind with flickering neon signs and sticky tabletops. The waitress barely glanced at them as they slid into a booth. The producer ordered 2 coffees, black. "So," he said, "how long have you been playing?" The man wrapped his hands around the steaming mug, savoring the warmth. "Since I was a kid," he said. "Played in bars, clubs, even a few studios back in the day." The producer leaned in. "You recorded before?" A shadow passed over the man's face. "Yeah. Long time ago. Things didn't work out. There was more to it, there always was." But the producer didn't push. Instead, he asked, "You ever think about playing again? Like, professionally?" The man let out a quiet laugh. "Look at me. Who's gonna listen to a guy like this?" The producer didn't hesitate. "I would." Silence settled between them. The hum of the diner, the clinking of spoons, the distant laughter from the kitchen, it all faded into the background. The homeless man stared into his coffee, his fingers tapping an absent rhythm on the table. Finally, he looked up. "Why?" The producer took a deep breath. "Because the world needs to hear what you just played in that alley." The man's eyes flickered, something between disbelief and the faintest spark of hope. And then, just as the waitress refilled their cups, he said the words that would change everything. "All right. Tell me what you've got in mind." The producer exhaled slowly, relieved the man hadn't outright refused. He took a sip of his coffee, buying himself a second to think. This wasn't just some impulsive idea anymore, it felt important. "I've got a studio," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's got good equipment. We could record a few of your songs, see how they sound cleaned up." The homeless man rubbed his thumb over a chip in his coffee mug. "You don't even know if I've got more songs." "Then play me another one." A pause. Then, almost reluctantly, the man began humming under his breath, a low, mournful tune that seemed to rise and fall like a story with no happy ending. His fingers tapped the table in place of guitar strings, but the melody was unmistakably powerful. The producer felt it again, that rare, electric feeling of discovering something raw and real. He'd chased that feeling for years in the music industry, only to drown in auto-tune and market-tested hooks. But this? This was gold. "I've got a deal for you," he said. "Come to the studio tomorrow. Just one session. If you hate it, no hard feelings. If you like it, we'll figure out the rest after." The man's shoulders tensed. "Why would you do this?" The producer shrugged. "Maybe I'm tired of hearing the same thing over and over. Maybe I think people need to hear you." He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "No pressure. Just show up if you want to." The homeless man stared at the card like it might vanish if he blinked. Then, with a slow nod, he tucked it into his jacket pocket, a jacket that had clearly seen better days. The producer paid the bill, and they stepped back out into the cold city air. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, without another word, the homeless man turned and disappeared into the crowd, his guitar case bumping against his leg with every step. The producer watched him go, wondering if he'd actually show up. Wondering if this was just another dead end. But something in his gut told him it wasn't. The next morning, the producer arrived early, nerves buzzing. He cleaned up the studio, tuned the spare guitar he kept around, and even made coffee, something he never did. His assistant raised an eyebrow. "Who's the special guest?" "Just a guy I met." Hours passed. No sign of him. The producer tried to focus on work, but his eyes kept drifting to the door. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe the guy had laughed it off the second he walked away. Then, at noon, the studio door creaked open. There he stood, hair still messy, clothes the same as yesterday, but his guitar case in hand. He looked around the studio like he wasn't sure he belonged. The producer grinned. "You came." The man shifted on his feet. "Yeah, well, figured I had nothing to lose." And with that, the real journey began. The studio smelled like old wood and coffee, familiar comforts to the producer, but the homeless man stood frozen just inside the doorway, gripping his guitar case like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His eyes darted across the soundboard, the microphones, the headphones hanging neatly on their hooks. "You ever been in a place like this before?" the producer asked. The man swallowed hard. "Once. A long time ago. There was a story there, but now wasn't the time." The producer gestured to the worn couch against the wall. "Why don't you warm up a bit first? Get comfortable." The man didn't move. "You sure about this?" "I ain't exactly." He looked down at his frayed sleeves, his cracked shoes. The producer grabbed 2 bottles of water from the mini fridge and tossed one to him. "Music doesn't care what you're wearing." For the first time, the man cracked a real smile. First takes. The producer watched through the control room glass as the homeless man settled onto the stool in the live room, gently removing his battered guitar from its case. The instrument looked even worse under studio lights, deep scratches, a crack near the bridge, strings that had clearly been replaced one at a time as they broke. But when the man's fingers touched the strings, none of that mattered. He played the same haunting melody from the alley, but now, through professional mics and speakers, every note rang clear and true. The producer found himself holding his breath. This wasn't just good, it was transcendent. Raw emotion poured from those rusty strings, filling the room with something indescribable. When the last note faded, the control room was silent. The producer realized his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the talkback button. That was, "Let's do that again." The man looked up, surprised. It wasn't right? No, it was perfect. I just want to capture it from another angle. They worked for hours. The homeless man played song after song, some half-finished, some polished like gems, all bearing the marks of a life lived hard. Between takes, he'd sip water and stare at the floor, as if surprised to find himself here. During a break, the producer finally asked the question that had been burning in his chest. These songs, where do they come from? The man studied his calloused fingers. Same place all songs come from, I guess. The good, the bad, the things you can't say out loud. The revelation. It happened during take 7 of the third song. The man lost himself in the music, eyes closed, voice rough but achingly sincere as he sang. 5 years gone like whiskey down the drain. All my promises turned to rain. When he finished, there were tears in his eyes. The producer didn't mention it, just quietly marked the take as a keeper. As they wrapped for the day, the homeless man carefully packed up his guitar. His hands moved slower now, the exhaustion of emotional labor setting in. You coming back tomorrow? The producer asked, trying to sound casual. The man paused at the door. You want me to? I think we're onto something special here. For a long moment, the man just stood there. Then he nodded once. All right. Tomorrow. As the door closed behind him, the producer immediately replayed the day's recordings. Each take was better than the last, each song a piece of the man's soul laid bare. He knew, with sudden certainty, that this music needed to be heard. Not just by him, by the world. But first, they had to finish what they'd started. The homeless man didn't just return the next day, he arrived early, waiting outside the studio when the producer showed up. His guitar case rested against the wall, and he stood straighter than before, as if something inside him had shifted overnight. You're here before me, the producer said, unlocking the door. Couldn't sleep, the man admitted, following him inside. Kept hearing the songs in my head, the way they sounded in here. The producer hid a smile. He knew that feeling, the addictive buzz of creation. He just never expected to see it in someone who'd been sleeping on cardboard weeks ago. Finding the sound. Today was different. Yesterday had been about capturing raw performances, today, they refined. The producer suggested small changes, a pause held longer here, a vocal line delivered softer there. To his surprise, the homeless man wasn't defensive. He listened, tried things, and when an idea worked, his eyes lit up like a kid discovering magic. During a break, the man stared at the studio monitors. Never thought I'd hear my music sound like this, he murmured. The producer handed him a sandwich he'd ordered in. This is just the beginning. Wait till we add some light strings behind this one track. No. The man's voice was firm. No strings. No fancy stuff. Just, me. The guitar. The truth. The producer opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. The man was right. The power was in the simplicity. The first listener. The producer's assistant, a sharp-eared young woman who'd worked on dozens of projects, stopped by to drop off some files. As she turned to leave, the homeless man launched into a new song, one they hadn't recorded yet. She froze in the doorway. 3 minutes later, when the last note faded, she had tears in her eyes. What? Who is that? She whispered. The producer just smiled. We're calling it, Alleyway Psalms. The assistant looked at the homeless man with new respect. That's going to wreck people. In the best way. For the first time, the man seemed to truly grasp what was happening here. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had kept him alive through street performances and spare change, now creating something that moved people to tears in a professional studio. The offer. As they wrapped for the day, the producer took a deep breath. I want to release these songs. Properly. With your name on them. The homeless man stiffened. No. Why not? People need to hear this. And then what? The man's voice turned sharp. People like you swoop in, make a big deal about discovering some homeless guy, pat yourselves on the back, and when the novelty wears off? He made a disappearing gesture with his hands. I've seen how this story goes. The producer leaned forward. Not this time. 50-50 split on everything. Your name, your story, you control what we share. No exploitation. Just the music. The room went quiet. The homeless man studied the producer's face, searching for lies. Finding none, he asked the most vulnerable question yet. Why would you do that? Because, the producer said simply, I don't want to be part of the problem. I want to be part of the music. A glimpse behind the curtain. That night, as they left the studio together, the homeless man hesitated under a streetlight. You want to know why I ended up on the streets? The producer waited. Wasn't drugs. Wasn't even money, really. The man's voice grew quiet. I just stopped believing anyone cared about real music anymore. Stopped believing in me. He met the producer's eyes. You're either the dumbest guy in this city, or maybe I was wrong. With that, he turned and walked into the night, leaving the producer standing there, realizing something terrifying and wonderful. This wasn't just about recording songs anymore. This was about redemption. The next morning, the producer arrived at the studio to find the homeless man already waiting, but something was different. His hair was damp, his face freshly shaved, and he wore clean clothes that almost fit. The producer blinked. You look like a human being? The man gave a wry smile. Found a shelter with showers last night. Figured if we're doing this proper. He trailed off, suddenly self-conscious. The producer nodded, understanding. This wasn't just about hygiene, it was about reclaiming dignity. The recording that changed everything. They worked on the final tracks with new intensity. The homeless man, the musician, the producer corrected himself, sang with a clarity that cut straight to the bone. On the last song, a heart-wrenching ballad about loss, his voice broke on the final chorus. Keep it, he said when the producer moved to stop the recording. That's how it's supposed to sound. When they listened back, even the engineer, a grizzled veteran who'd worked with Grammy winners, had to wipe his eyes. Christ. That's the real deal right there. The musician sat very still, hearing his pain transformed into art. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he looked like he believed in something again. The risk. Over coffee, the producer laid out his plan. I want to release one song online. No big announcement, no homeless musician angle. Just the music. See what happens. The man gripped his cup tighter. And if nobody cares? Then we try again. Or we don't. Your call. A long silence. Then a single nod. That afternoon, the producer uploaded Alleyway Psalms to a streaming platform with minimal metadata, just the song title and artist name, the name the man had finally given, though he wasn't ready for the world to know it yet. They both stared at the screen as the status changed to live. The wait. Days passed. The musician crashed on the studio couch, too anxious to return to the streets. The producer refreshed the analytics hourly. 50 plays. Then 100. Then. Look at this. The producer turned his laptop around. A popular music blogger had discovered the track and written, "This anonymous artist sounds like the ghost of every great folk singer come back to haunt us. Who is this guy?" The musician's hands trembled. That's real? By week's end, the song had been shared by an indie label owner. A famous singer tweeted the lyrics. Play count skyrocketed. The choice. The producer's phone started blowing up. Labels. Reporters. Podcasters. Everyone wanted to know, who was the mystery voice behind Alleyway Psalms. The musician paced the studio like a caged animal. This is too fast. We can slow it down, the producer said. Or. He took a deep breath. We could tell your story. On your terms. The man stopped pacing. Outside, rain began pattering against the studio windows, the first storm of the season. I need to show you something, he said suddenly. From his battered backpack, he pulled out a yellowed photograph, a younger version of himself on stage, holding a guitar, standing next to. The producer's breath caught. Is that? Yeah. The man's voice was thick. Toured with him in '98. Had a record deal lined up. Then. He pointed to the fresh clothes. These aren't from a shelter. I went back to my storage unit. Paid 5 years overdue rent with what you gave me last week. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just some talented street performer. This was a man who'd once been on the brink of success before life knocked him down, hard. The truth comes out. That night, they drafted a simple post together, no pity, no grand comeback narrative. Just facts. A musician who'd walked away from the industry. Songs written in the shadows. A chance meeting in an alley. They included one recent photo, the musician sitting on the studio floor with his guitar, looking directly at the camera, his eyes telling entire novels of pain and hope. Before hitting publish, the producer handed him the mouse. Your call. The musician stared at the screen for a full minute. Then, with a click that sounded louder than it was. Let's see what happens. Within minutes, the internet exploded. The notifications came like a flood, comments, shares, messages from people who'd never heard his music until that morning. The musician watched the numbers climb with a mix of awe and terror, his knee bouncing uncontrollably under the studio desk. Breathe, the producer said, handing him a glass of water. This is what we wanted, remember? The man's laugh came out shaky. Wanting it and living it are two different things. The world reacts. By noon, the post had been shared by major music accounts. A famous folk singer, someone the musician had once opened for, posted, "Wherever you've been, welcome back. The world needs this voice." But the most gut-punching moment came when an old bandmate messaged, "Man, I looked for you for years. So damn glad you're still playing." The musician had to walk out of the studio then, disappearing for 2 hours. When he returned, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. Sorry. Had to process. The producer just nodded. Some things didn't need words. The interview. A respected music journalist reached out, offering to tell the story properly. The musician hesitated until the producer showed him her work. No clickbait. No homeless to hero crap. Just music journalism. They met at a quiet cafe. At first, the musician spoke in monosyllables, shoulders hunched like he expected a trap. But when the journalist asked about the songs, not his past, just the music, something unlocked. That one, he said, pointing to a lyric sheet, came to me under a bridge during a thunderstorm. The rain on the pavement sounded like a snare drum. The interview ran with the headline, "The best musician you didn't know was missing." The offer they couldn't refuse. An independent label, the kind known for treating artists right, proposed a one-album deal with creative control. The musician stared at the contract like it might bite him. "They're not signing you because you're a feel-good story," the producer said firmly. "They're signing you because those demos are genius." That night, the musician did something he hadn't done in a decade, he called his sister. The producer gave him privacy, but couldn't help overhearing one broken sentence, "Yeah, it's really me." Yeah, I'm clean. No, I never stopped playing. The first performance. A small club offered a headlining slot. The musician nearly backed out 3 times, once while tuning his guitar backstage, his hands shaking too badly to twist the pegs. The producer handed him a pick. You know what to do. The sold-out crowd fell silent when he walked on stage. No introduction, no hype, just a man, a guitar, and the truth. He played the first note. And for the next hour, nobody breathed. The aftermath. After the show, people lined up to meet him, not for selfies, but to say things like, "Your song got me through chemo," and "I heard my life in that last verse." The musician took each hand like he couldn't believe they were real. Back at the studio, exhausted but buzzing, the producer finally asked the question that had been burning for weeks: "Why did you really quit music back then?" The musician stared at the wall for a long time. Got tired of being told my songs were too raw. Tired of watching hacks with pretty faces get deals while I played to empty bars. He shrugged. One day I just walked away. Then walking turned to drifting, drifting to drowning. He met the producer's eyes. Until some idiot heard me in an alley. They sat in comfortable silence, the hum of the studio equipment like a third voice. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that something extraordinary had just taken root in its shadows. The album release party should have been a victory lap. The indie label had rented out a small, dimly lit venue, the kind with good acoustics and better whiskey. Critics had already heard the full record, and the early reviews used words like masterpiece and a reckoning. But as the producer scanned the buzzing crowd, his stomach tightened. The musician was nowhere to be found. The disappearance. He wasn't answering his phone. Wasn't at his new apartment, paid for by the advance, a fact that still made the man uneasy. The producer checked the alley where they'd first met, nothing but an empty cardboard box and the faint smell of rain. Then it hit him. 10 minutes later, he pushed open the door of the all-night diner where they'd first really talked. And there he was, sitting in the exact same booth, staring into a cooling cup of coffee like it held the secrets of the universe. "You're missing your own party," the producer said, sliding in across from him. The musician didn't look up. "Know how many guys like me get one shot, let alone 2. The producer opened his mouth, but the man kept going. "Went to my storage unit last week. Found a box of old set lists, tour passes, contracts." His finger traced a watermark ring on the table. 20 years ago, I would have killed for this kind of buzz. Now? He finally met the producer's eyes. "I'm scared I'll fuck it up again." The truth in the parking lot. They stood outside in the cold, sharing a cigarette the musician had bummed off the cook. "You're not the same guy you were back then," the producer said. "How do you know?" "Because that guy would have been front and center at that party, soaking up the hype." The producer flicked ash onto the pavement. "You're here. Worrying about whether the music's good enough." The musician took a long drag. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed, then cut out abruptly. "Album's good," he said finally. "The hell it is. It's great." A ghost of a smile. "Even if it flops?" "Especially if it flops. Means we made something real." The musician stubbed out the cigarette. "All right. Let's go face the music." The return. They entered the venue just as the label owner was starting to panic. The crowd erupted when they spotted the musician, not cheers, but something deeper. A collective inhale. He didn't take the stage. Instead, he moved through the room, shaking hands, listening more than talking. A grizzled music blogger gripped his shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "This is the record the rest of us will spend 10 years trying to make." Later, when the producer found himself cornered by an A&R rep sniffing for the next big thing, he glanced across the room. The musician was sitting on a speaker, tuning the house guitar, completely oblivious to the industry sharks circling. In that moment, the producer realized something. This was never about comebacks or redemption arcs. It was always about the music. The performance. Someone shouted for him to play. Then everyone was shouting. The musician looked at the producer, who shrugged, "Your call." He took the guitar. No microphone. No introduction. Just the same raw voice that had stopped the producer in his tracks months ago. He played the first song he'd ever written in that alley, the one that started it all. This time, when he sang the line about "promises turn to rain," the room sang it back to him. The morning after. They ended up back at the studio at 4 a.m., too wired to sleep. The musician flopped onto the couch, his dress shirt wrinkled, his good shoes scuffed. "Think it'll chart?" he asked, staring at the ceiling. "Who cares?" The producer booted up the recording gear. "We've got album 2 to plan." The musician laughed, a real, full-bellied sound the producer had never heard before. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the sky in bruised purples and pinks. Somewhere in the city, a busker played for spare change. A kid uploaded their first song online. A radio host slotted "Alleyway Psalms" into heavy rotation. And in a small studio that smelled like coffee and old wood, two men who'd started as strangers passed a guitar back and forth, chasing the next perfect note.